Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I've got quite a bit I want to share with you this morning, so we're going to dive right into this. The preface to this message this morning is this. Some sermons, the text, you always want to preach, obviously, what the text communicates. And so some sermons, the text invites great opportunity to speak about very comforting, very encouraging things to a congregation. Other times, the text might be more challenging, and it might make us all feel a little bit uncomfortable, which is great at times. And then I think that there's these other texts that maybe do a bit of both all in one, but the purpose of them is actually just for Christian maturation and for our discipleship and for becoming better at being the church. This past week, I heard a Christian leader suggest, this is a big suggestion, that the number one issue facing the world today is whether or not Christians, those who identify as Christian, will choose whether or not to be disciples. I love the distinction. Will those who identify as Christian choose whether or not to be disciples of Jesus? Number one issue facing the world today. So today we're going to talk about then being more like Jesus, being disciples, but particularly more like Jesus to those who are new to the faith, to those who are babies, who are new to the family, we could say. So as many of you know, my dad has been in vocational ministry my entire life. I mean, I cut my teeth in ministry. I was getting dragged to Mexico before I could say Mexico. It was just part of our family's dynamic and culture. And what my dad did for a living often caused unfair expectations to be put on me. Anybody else who grew up as a pastor's kid, you know that this is a unique assignment that God gives to some of us. So I'll spare you the specific details about those expectations, but I will say that it was a regular part of my life until I got old enough to stop caring what stuffy, square, churchy people thought about me, and I just kind of moved on with who I thought I was and who I thought God said I was. But some general examples of these experiences, and I'm sure some of you experienced this just because you had, parents that grew up in sort of a holiness tradition, but I was told things like take my hat off in church. I was told that I wasn't allowed to get earrings. And then I was told that if I did get earrings, I couldn't go to Bible college, or if I went to Bible college, they'd tell me to take my earrings out. Then I got a job that was with a Christian organization shortly after Chantel and I were married, and they did make me take my earrings out. And they've never been back. I was expected to act certain ways, attend certain functions happily because of what my dad did. Needless to say, I never responded particularly well to the expectations. And you fast forward a couple decades later, and I'm sitting in my parents' living room with my grandparents. My grandpa was nearly 90 at this time. He notices a tattoo on my arm. And he makes a mostly lighthearted comment about, doesn't the Bible say something about not marking one's body with a tattoo? And so I laughed and smiled at him, and I said, yeah, Grandpa, I think it does. And he was mostly saying it lightheartedly, but because he was like a long-time Pentecostal, I know there was just a little bit of conviction intended in the comment. Now, to be fair to him, Leviticus 19 does say that. It does say that. But it also says not to wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. It also says not to plant two seeds together. It also says not to use dishonest measuring standards. And if I were to think about my grandpa for a second, I'm pretty sure I have noticed a thread or two of polyester in his cotton shirts from time to time. I've noticed that his flower baskets have a wide variety of floral species, all planted with different seeds. And I'm pretty sure he does lie about how much salt he puts in his meatballs. All right. So I share these examples as a springboard into this great question that Christians have had much debate about across every century. That question is what matters and what doesn't. What should and shouldn't be done? What is mandatory? What is not mandatory? What is good but not required? What is neither good nor bad? Now, if I'm the first pastor to lick this in a single sermon, I deserve some kind of prize. I'm not going to do that. I'm confident. But we are going to talk about this. We're going to talk about it from this great historical story from the early church as they process these questions. And I will say this, though we're not the first people to deal with this, I feel confident that God has been grieved by every generation as we rob each other of the joy of living in the aftermath of Christ's victory of grace. All because we like to, for whatever reason, major on minors and fight over things that really don't matter. And so this morning we're going to look at Acts 15. Now, Acts 15 is sort of a crossroad chapter in the book of Acts. It is the record of the very first church council in the history of Christendom. The first time all the guys got together and put all their brains at work at the same time for the same purpose, and they came to a conclusion. At this council, these Christian leaders come together to discuss and consider and make a judgment about the Gentile converts and the requirements of the Jewish law for them or not for them. So I'm going to give you some context for how we got here, but I'm going to look to the Bible Project to show you a quick video of this Jerusalem Council, because it's a really important thing for, I think, the church to understand and to understand what Acts 15 is all about. So it'll take about a minute and a half, and then we'll jump back in.
Now, in recounting all of these stories, Luke has highlighted a number of important themes by repeating them. So first is the continued mission to Israel. Whenever Paul enters a new city, he always goes first to the Jewish synagogue to share about the risen King Jesus and how he's forming a new multi-ethnic family of God. Now, most often, lots of people come to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, but some oppose Paul. Sometimes they even throw him out of town as a dangerous rebel who opposes the Torah and Jewish tradition. And this tension culminates after the first journey, leading to an important council in Jerusalem. So Paul discovers that there are some Jewish Christians in Antioch, and they're claiming that unless non-Jewish people become Jewish by practicing circumcision, the Sabbath, obeying the kosher food laws, that they can't become part of Jesus' family. But Paul and Barnabas, they radically disagree. And so they take the debate to a leadership council in Jerusalem. Now there, Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, they all show from the scriptures and from their experience that God's plan was always to include the nations within his covenant people. So they write a letter requiring non-Jewish Christians to stop participating in pagan temple sacrifices, but they don't require them to adopt an ethnically Jewish identity or obey the laws in the Torah. Now, this decision was groundbreaking for the history of the Jesus movement. Jesus, he's the Jewish Messiah, but he's also the risen King of all nations. And so one's membership among his people is not based on ethnic identity or following the laws of the Torah. It's based simply on trusting Jesus and then following his teachings.
So there you go. So what happens is this group shows up in Antioch. We've been talking about Antioch a little bit lately. And they give this really disturbing message, which is this: unless you are circumcised and buy into all the laws of Moses, this is what they say: you are not saved. What a thing to tell somebody who's accepted Jesus by faith. You are not saved unless. So Paul and Barnabas are frustrated and they head off to Jerusalem and they go, what are we going to do? And so we're going to pick up in verse 22 of this story, looking at this issue of what do we do with the Gentiles who have come to faith but are not Jewish, either in custom or in ethnicity. What are we going to do? So jumping in at verse 22. Then the apostles and elders with the whole church decided to choose some of their own men and send them to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They chose Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas, men who were leaders among the believers. With them they sent the following letter. So this is now a letter of their judgment, their conclusion. The apostles and elders, your brothers. So ancient letters always started with who it's coming from. So the apostles and elders, your brothers. What a great way to start. That's rather warm. Greetings. We have heard that some went out from us without our authorization and disturbed you, troubling your minds by what they said. So we all agreed to choose some men and send them to you with our dear friends Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore we are sending Judas and Silas to confirm by word of mouth what we are writing. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. You are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You will do well to avoid these things. Farewell. So the men were sent off and went down to Antioch, where they gathered the church together and delivered the letter. The people read it and were glad for its encouraging message. So in my opinion, Luke gives us such a gift by including this record of this council. How this early church reached a consensus decision regarding how best to build a bridge between Gentiles who were coming to faith and the Christian Jews who were still devoted to the practice of circumcision and the law of Moses, even though they believed Jesus was the Messiah. And I love that this council receives input from Peter, the leader of the apostles, Paul, the great champion of the church and the apostle to the Gentiles, and James the Just, the leader of the elders in Jerusalem, the brother of Jesus himself, and the presiding authority over this whole council. Three of the great heroes of the New Testament, together with others like Barnabas and Silas, seeking God's will literally for the world. Actually gives me goosebumps as I think about what was taking place in these conversations. Of all the things that they could have discussed, the theology that they could have developed, the missions plan that they could have orchestrated, the church governance documents they could have come up with, they didn't do any of that, and these mighty men put their strength together to figure out how to make fellowship possible for everyone who's come to Jesus by faith. And then discerning, in this instance, what matters and what doesn't. And I think that for us, we are still prone to split hairs over what doesn't always matter that much, especially in regard to those who are new to the faith. And so I think it's helpful to look at this council, what they gave their time and their energy and their conviction to. So we're going to look at sort of the meat of this message in a moment, but I do want to just say this before we jump into it. At no point in this message am I going to suggest, on purpose, and I hope not by accident, that the unchanging, critical, central piece of the gospel is salvation by faith in Jesus Christ. That never changes, it never shifts, it is not up for debate. If you want to belong to God's family, that is the way in. But after that, the council was clear on what matters and what doesn't in regards to being saved. And so our first takeaway from this passage is that belonging through belief matters. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Jumping to 19, James the Just says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." So a few years ago, there was a statement that was floating around church circles. It was in books, it was getting used in sermons. The statement was this: you don't have to believe to belong. Now, I confess to you, at one time I was guilty of saying this. I think I probably thought it was cool or made me like relevant or something. But I admit as I've aged, I'm embarrassed that I ever entertained such a ridiculous idea. The only way a person can belong to God's family is through belief in Jesus Christ. Yes, you do have to believe. It's the only way in. It's the only way we're adopted in. Sure, you can come to a church, and if you're here today and you haven't put faith in Jesus, I'm glad you're here, and I hope you feel very at home amongst this community. So you can belong to this little gathering, but to the family of God, there's only one way in, and that's through belief in Jesus. It's the only way to be saved. And so for some of you, maybe that's a hard pill to swallow. Maybe you wish it wasn't that way, that there weren't any requirements to belong to God, to his family. But what I do hope is that we actually see that this is very, very good news, that all it takes is belief in Jesus Christ. That's it. And the only way that any of us should feel troubled about how to belong is if we have to start adding to our faith, adding extras to save ourselves. And I do think it's helpful to consider how easy it is to trouble others regarding their place in God's family, especially those young or immature in their faith. And so we read in this story that these troublemakers come from Jerusalem, the central place of the church, the central place of gospel history. This is where like the most important people go to make the most important decisions. And coming from Jerusalem is this group of people, and they come and they act as if they have special authority based on where they're coming from and based on the fact that they're Jewish and they are from the covenant people. And they begin to convince these new Gentile believers that they should be listened to based on their ethnicity and their location. These became tools to be used as false authority. Now, I'm a huge fan of true authority. I think we need authority in Christian circles and in church. And that authority should be respected. But false credentials as a tool to persuade or convince, that's actually wrong. And this is what these true believers participating in this Jerusalem council want to correct and ultimately eradicate. They didn't want those of Jewish ancestry and religious practice, and even an important location as their hometown, to burden Gentile converts by demanding that they meet all of their expectations, which were rooted in their history and in their customs, or else they be rejected from the family of God. And so instead, James and the other apostles, the leaders, agree that those of Jewish background, but saved in faith by faith in Jesus, must recognize and embrace Gentile believers as sisters and brothers in Christ, and not burden them by asking them to add to their faith either circumcision or the whole code of Jewish practices. Now, I'm aware that it might be easy for us to look at this and say, well, of course we're not going to have new believers come through the door and circumcise them. Like, of course we're not going to do that today. I mean, talk about an HR nightmare. if I can be so crass. But I think you get what I'm saying. Like, this seems a little first century, right? But we do have our own moral standards. We do have our own good Christian behavior that we think dictates what does and doesn't make a good Christian. And so, as goofy as it is, we do have standards for what a person wears. Whether alcohol consumption is okay, if cussing is a sin, if smoking tobacco is a deal breaker. And these are just a few examples of silly standards that anyone who's hung around in the church long enough knows to pop up from time to time. Both of my mom's grandparents, so my great-great-grandparents on my mother's side, were longtime pastors. And both my parents and grandparents talk about the tension in the late 60s and early 70s as the Jesus people came out of the hippie movement, got saved, and started showing up at church. If you were old enough to have been there, you remember dirty clothes, long hair, bare feet, smoking in between services. And these were reason to keep people out of the church and even God's family. There's a great scene in the movie Jesus Revolution where Chuck Smith fighting with his elders, and the elders are going, they're making us uncomfortable. And he says, maybe it's my job to make you uncomfortable, which as a pastor, of course, I loved. I think that the voice of James the Just was needed as much in the first century for the Jesus people, the Jesus freaks, as it is today. A voice that says none of those externals matter when it comes to belonging to God. What matters is belonging through belief. What matters is that we don't add burdens to those coming to faith and trying to grow and learn. What an amazing thing to be convinced and convicted of, that we shouldn't burden the babies. That's wisdom. What does matter is what's going on in a person's heart. What doesn't matter is them looking perfect on the outside according to our standards. You remember Jesus called those only focused on the outside whitewashed tombs? Remember what he was saying? They look perfect on the outside and they are dead on the inside. I suggest to you with great humility, because I'm counted amongst this group, there is a Pharisee lurking in every one of us. And it takes one person doing something we wouldn't do before we start acting like whitewashed tombs towards people who are just trying to take their place in God's family. And so if we want to live the whole story, I do think we need to ensure that our expectations of those joining God's family are ruled by a priority of belonging by belief, not burdens of personal customs and values and preferences based on our church history and maybe our excellent attendance record. Next, I think this counsel tells us that fellowship by love matters. So the judgment is you aren't to be burdened, but you are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, meat strangled animals, and sexual immorality, and you will do well to avoid these things. So I suspect everybody in this room knows the growing pains of families expanding. Now, I'm not talking so much about the addition of children, but the addition of in-laws. When Chantel and I were first married, my brothers were still in high school. And all the family traditions like Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, birthdays, how the Eagles did things, largely remained intact. It kind of was just business as usual. But then Chantel and I had kids. And as I think the Bible instructs, we began to, in a way, leave our father and mother and start to make a family of our own and make our own memories and our own traditions and things like this. And this was, of course, then growing and stretching for my parents and my brothers as those common expected things began to look different and feel different. Then my brothers got married and they had their own children, and then they went through the same process, and then everything kind of changed. And the people sort of living in the aftermath of that is mom and dad going, where'd everybody go? Right? But it can be painful. It can be painful for brothers and sisters and even cousins and as things change. And I think in a way that's what we see happening in this first century story, this church, that sometimes family traditions shift. Compromises have to be made. Things need to be let go of. And some things need to be accepted. And for families that see being together as worth it, then solutions are sought, agreements are reached, grace is extended, often, and then letting love rather than rigid tradition emerges the connection point and the reason. And so the Gentiles join the family. The family from Antioch's coming. And the Jewish Christians had to let go of these expectations of how the family's now going to look, how we're going to celebrate holidays. And the Gentiles had to adopt some customs of the family that they were joining so that we can get along. And so that's what we're reading about in verse 29. James and the rest of the council determined that it's important to ensure that the Gentiles aren't burdened, but then a new question emerges, which was how would Jewish Christians who are still observant of the law and customs have fellowship with Gentiles who are not following the same laws and customs? And this is bigger than when do you open your presents, Christmas Eve or Christmas morning. This is an issue of impure and unclean. And so we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that Jews couldn't associate with those who were deemed to be unclean based on what they ate and based on sexual practice. That those things made them unclean, and by associations, it was like cooties. The Jews became unclean, and then they had to go through a whole process to get themselves washed up so they could be holy before God again. And so they're actually going, okay, well, if we're going to bring these Gentiles in and these Jews are still going to be living according to these customs, how are they going to do this? Like, it's actually a problem. So the council goes, well, how can fellowship happen? How can we be in the same room together? And what they came up with was to ask each group to seek fellowship through love by letting some things go and adding some things. So the council gives 4 stipulations for the Gentiles to follow. Abstain from food offered to idols, abstain from the meat of strangled animals, abstain from blood, and from sexual immorality. Now, it's quite likely that when this letter arrives, these Gentiles who are coming to faith read it and they go, okay, that makes sense. They had a far better understanding of Jewish life in the first century than any of us do. So we, on the other hand, are probably going, well, why those 4 things? And so the first 3 requirements, we could say, are all related to food. So you've got meat that had been offered to idols, which was an abomination to Jews. And so they avoided everything, including food, that was associated with false gods and idolatry. Strangled meat was a problem because it referred to animals that had been slaughtered in a manner that didn't drain the blood. And blood, which was considered sacred to Jews, had to be let go of. It had to be emptied out so that they could eat it. And so eating food with blood in it contaminated them in like 2 different ways. It wasn't slaughtered properly, but also blood was a sacred thing and needed to be not touched. Now, these 3 requirements are very much ritual in nature. They're habitual. It's the way we do these things. But then sexual immorality is less ritual, it seems, and a little bit more moral, and yet I think that there's actually crossover, which we'll briefly talk about. So sexual immorality, this is, of course, in 2024, going to grab everybody's attention more than like strangled meat. So this term, sexual immorality, is the Greek translation, the Greek word porneia, which, yes, you hear porn in there. So it's a term that is really broad in its meaning, and it refers to basically all types of unsanctioned sex. So, if we were to look at a Jewish perspective and what did they deem to be unsanctioned sex, let's go through a few. Prostitution, sex outside of marriage, fornication, incest, bestiality, homosexual relationships, and then marriage within close degrees of kinship. Like, you don't need to shack up with your sister, things like that. Now, when it comes to sexuality, the boundary between, again, ritual and ethical sort of gets more blurred than it does with food laws. For the Jew, you see, sexual misbehavior was both immoral and impure. And because of this, a Jew then would find it extremely difficult to associate with a Gentile who didn't live by those standards of Jewish sexuality. And the Gentiles were generally a bit more relaxed about such things. Now, we could hang out here and talk about sex for a long time. And in 2024, we probably all get very excited and all have opinions. But that's not what Luke is getting at here. And so to go off on a massive tangent on that would actually miss the whole point of what the author is intending for us to understand, which is this, that this counsel wasn't about morality, it was about fellowship and belonging. It wasn't about rules. It was about finding a way rather for full relationship to flourish between the original family members and the ones who were being added. And this has a lot of practical application today, but maybe not quite in the way you'd expect. Now, you've heard this before. That's just what I do, or that's just the way I am. And if you don't like it, that's your problem. I get it. There's some times where that is maybe fair. But the Jerusalem Council's conclusion on this day is that Christians need to be really careful that love promotes and protects fellowship, And love sometimes looks like doing what it can to not offend others. In fact, the whole book of Romans is basically dealing at length with what happens when those who are a little bit weaker, a little bit more sensitive, are offended by those who feel a little bit more strong in their conscience. So Paul uses language of the strong and the weak, because people were being hurt and offended by people that honestly just weren't as religious. Paul also comments on this type of thing in Corinthians, talking about our conscience. And Paul says something, and the Jerusalem Council is making this point, that a strong conscience does give liberty of behavior. But, more importantly, for the individual Canadians in 2024, we should limit our liberty out of love for the weak. That is the message. We limit our liberty out of love for the weak. Weak meaning perhaps someone who's easily offended. Weak meaning perhaps someone who's new to the faith and their legs are a little bit wobbly still as they're learning to walk. Weak meaning somebody who maybe struggles very seriously with the area where you feel you have so much liberty. I mean, I could give you really easy examples, like maybe for some, you can watch movies that are full of sexuality. And maybe you have no problem with that. And maybe the person you're watching the movie with has a serious addiction to such practices. And so your liberty in that moment may cause the weaker to stumble. Your liberty in drinking may be great, no problem. But you may be in fellowship with somebody whose entire family have been alcoholics, and it brings up painful memories. And maybe they struggle with addiction. So in this instance, probably the healthy thing to do is limit our liberty out of love for the weaker member of the family. And so the Jerusalem Council reminds us that maintaining Christian fellowship is more important than you being you. Take it or leave it. Love limiting liberty for the sake of the other will always promote and protect the family fellowship. Finally, when it comes to welcoming new people into the family of God, gladness and encouragement really do matter. (30 and 31). So the men were sent off and went down to Antioch, where they gathered the church together and delivered the letter. The people read it and were glad for its encouraging message. So I suspect I speak for many in this room when I say there have been times when being included in God's family didn't bring gladness and encouragement. It brought accusation and it brought rules. And it brought stiffness and it brought stuffiness. And long before you learned the wonders of the depths of God's grace, you learned a specific church culture and church rules. And if you didn't abide by them, well, you weren't sure if you were saved. And the very message of acceptance that you probably heard somewhere by somebody speaking God's grace into your life was then complicated very quickly by someone else's words and perhaps actions, as shame and guilt and inadequacy were piled on. You know, it doesn't take very much, church, to rob those who are new and still vulnerable in the faith of whatever gladness and encouragement may have been there at first. All because those things that don't ultimately matter were made most important. And I'm so inspired by Luke's account of the Gentiles being glad and encouraged by the letter sent by the Christian leaders, the letter that begins with, brothers, your brothers. You know, it's not always our practice to imagine being in other people's shoes, to put ourselves into these stories. But if we imagine for just a moment what this would have been like to be in the Gentile shoes. If we go back to Peter going and speaking to Cornelius' house, and these Gentiles believe the gospel. They're filled with the Holy Spirit, with the evidence of speaking in tongues. They are baptized in water. And then they get to learn more and more about this from Peter, this leader of the apostles himself. And then sometime later, after experiencing all that, after learning all that, sometime later, the squares from Jerusalem show up and start saying, yeah, you know what, that wasn't good enough. Unless you are circumcised and follow the Jewish laws and customs, you aren't saved. Unless you do these things, there is no salvation from God and no association with God's people. I think if we were in their shoes, we would agree that would have been very confusing, quite hurtful. And gladness and encouragement would have been lost. The good news is that wasn't the end of the story. And I suppose it could have been. And what really mattered prevailed. And the council's decision is made. And a letter is written and it's placed in the Apostle Paul's hand. Barnabas and these other delegates, and off to Antioch they go to share the good news with the troubled Christians there. And good news it was. Luke says they were glad and encouraged. In the Greek, the word encouraged can also describe comfort or consolation, which gives a bigger picture to what they had been feeling. They were encouraged in that they were comforted and consoled. The message that you belong to the family comforted their troubled hearts and minds. Then in addition to that, the good news that the apostles and elders didn't agree with the position of these religious fanatics coming from Jerusalem. They were also encouraged by the truth that the decision that they belonged to the family because of faith rather than customs was a unanimous decision. It wasn't a 60-40 split. It wasn't, we barely agree. It was unanimous. Verse 25 we read in the letter, and the NIV doesn't give a great translation of this, but it says, so we all agreed. And there should probably be like a period there. So we agreed. And then we chose men and we sent them to you with our dear friends Barnabas and Paul. Eugene Peterson puts it like this in the Message. He says, everyone agreed. Apostles, leaders, and all the people. A unanimous decision. We're not going to burden you. And so the Gentile believers, that they rejoice that they don't have to be circumcised and they did not have to become Jewish proselytes. And that the apostles and elders were able to come to a unanimous decision on their belonging. And then finally, and maybe importantly for some of our libertarians in the room today, gladness and rejoicing also tells us that those 4 stipulations weren't burdensome to the Gentiles, as much as our Western eyes might want to defend them. They weren't burdened by what they heard. And it is quite possible that the gospel had so arrested these Gentiles that they were already doing these things. So church, again we find the reminder that when our way of doing things, our personal morality standard, our tradition, our passion for external expressions of morality become what matters most, people are burdened. And fellowship and gladness and encouragement by way of the gospel of grace are lost. But when belonging by faith and fellowship, by lovingly limiting liberty, when that is the most important, people are glad and encouraged for that message. People don't feel like it's impossible. People feel like it makes sense. And this is how I hope I come across to people who are new to the faith. I have a tricky job and I have to disciple Christians and interact with newcomers. And so sometimes it's hard to speak to everybody at the same time, exactly individually. But I do hope too, and I will keep fighting for this, that this is true of this church too. I hope that this is a church where people know we are passionate about truth, but we are not squares. We love grace. And don't misunderstand me either, because I think you've heard me preach long enough that you know that this would be true of me. I am well aware the New Testament has plenty to say about sin and conduct. I know that. In fact, I'm fairly passionate about it. And I am deeply passionate about Christian discipleship and maturation. That's like the passion of passions in my life. I believe living holy lives and taking our discipleship seriously is critical. So if you're not hearing that, I'm saying it to you. But we want to ensure that the first message that those new to the faith, weak in the faith, wobbly in the faith hear is welcome home. I hope that you find this place to be a community of rest and restoration. So how do we wrap this up? This first century council offering lessons for Northerners in 2024. And I think simply this, that it invites us and it reminds us to live out the whole story through the beauty of two victories. Two victories that were, if not one, certainly acknowledged at this council. And the first victory is the gospel of grace. That is, we are not saved by anything by faith alone, through Christ alone, through his grace. Whether young or old in the faith, that is always radical and should always be the best news you have heard today. That is a victory. And second, we should live out the victory that is love. A love which seeks to fight for fellowship by being willing to limit our liberty for those who may be offended or stumble due to our freedom. The Jews figured out how to be in Christian family with the Gentiles. And the Gentiles did with their liberty what was required to not make it hard for those Jews, still holding closely to those laws and customs that mattered to them. I read this week that John Newton, one of the real legends of Christian history, said during a meeting of the Eclectic Society, he said this about the Apostle Paul, that Paul was a reed in non-essentials and an iron pillar in essentials. A reed in non-essentials and an iron pillar in essentials. That is to say, Paul moved, gave way, he bent, he was willing to lay down over what did not matter most. But for that which was of central importance, he wouldn't bend an inch. And that is a powerful testimony. That's the testimony of this council. And I think that that's the message of Jesus Christ. And so as we turn our attention to the Lord's table, let's be sure to remember that this is not just the story of Gentile converts in the first century, but of all of our stories. Of all of our stories. Remember, Jesus said to us that his burden was light, that there is no burden in coming to Jesus, but that there's rest for the weary. Remember when Jesus said, I will not make it difficult for you to come to me and to remain in me. Paul teaches in Philippians that Jesus let go of what he had to include us. That is, he took the position of slave even though he was God. That's limiting liberty for love, so that we would forever have fellowship with him. Jesus didn't demand that we become him, exactly like him, in order to belong. Rather, he became one of us. He took on flesh and lived among us, feeling our pain and our humanity, and even dying our death. And by sending his Holy Spirit, he gave us the opportunity to join him in his life, and one day in his glory. Jesus is our brother. He's our friend. And yes, our Savior. Jesus is not a counsel, but he certainly is a wonderful counselor. And his burden is easy, his law is love. What a thing to remember as we come to his table.